to kind of get a sense of what the audience wants. So I just want to say a quick word about how much fun this can be and sort of what we're imagining going into these sessions. For those of you who attended yesterday can attest, the excellent talks we had yesterday often raised more questions than they answered. Pat O'Farrell talked about the danger of attractive ideas, but I think that leads us to a discussion about how we might best avoid running afoul of those dangerously attractive, but perhaps overly simplistic or inaccurate ideas. Ron Vale talked about how awesome it is to be Ron Vale, and so we might have a session about how to be Ron Vale. Alicia talked about many aspects of the sociology of science, and that could lead to a number of interesting discussions. So those are some ideas, but that's not in any way limiting. Also not limiting are the list of ideas that we posted next to the schedule. People have been kind of sounding in on the website and in emails with Liam about what they might be interested in hearing about. So if you just have the spirit moving you to give a session, but not necessarily, you're not sure what people will be interested in, or you're not sure what to talk about, you could get some inspiration from that. But really, anything goes. If it's interesting to you, chances are it is interesting to someone else. If you have two other people in the room, those are the two people who care about that the most, and you will have a great discussion. So don't worry about attracting a lot of people. This is about devoted, focused conversation on a topic of high interest to the individuals who attend. Things can really come out of these talks, as small scale as they are. At the last bar camp I attended, I gave a talk about something I knew nothing about. I announced in advance that I knew nothing about it, and I invited people to attend if they had something to say about it or if they also were just interested. It was about why textbooks aren't free. And we had a great discussion over the course of an hour, and it turns out that one of the attendees, actually one of the quieter attendees, is back in New Zealand working with the New Zealand government on an initiative to create free textbooks for secondary schools in New Zealand. And she was inspired by that moment, and we've been in touch over email. So you never know what's going to happen. There are a lot of great ideas circulating at the conference, and I just think it's important, and it'll be really fun to extend those ideas into focused conversations tomorrow. So I encourage you, if you're at all interested, to fill out one of these forms posted on the schedule. And I'll make these announcements over the course of the day, but definitely, if you're interested in giving a talk, show up, congregate at the end of the final session today near the schedule, because we will be rejiggering the schedule and moving some of the sheets of paper around. All right, thanks very much.
So thanks, Chris. Let's begin with our first speaker of the morning session. You'll see this face on the screen. This is not a computer-generated artificial intelligence. This is Satyajit Rath at the NII. He's coming to us from all the way around the world via Skype, and so we're very lucky to have him here, and we thank him for being able to connect in this way. And he's going to be telling us about the changing face of science in India.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, you can go ahead.
Okay. So good morning, everybody, and this is not the best way of doing this. I apologize. And if anybody is to be blamed for this, it is Liam. So he can stand up and take a bow. What I'm going to try and do today, particularly since I haven't been there yesterday and therefore I don't have any sense of either the content or the tenor of the way the meeting's going, although from the description I just heard, it sounds really exciting. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a sense of what it means when I say that my subtitle, which Liam had, was Science in the Backwaters, Competition and Community. And I'm going to start off with some India-specific descriptions of what it is like and what it means to do science in India, how it has changed over the past 30 years that I have known science in India as a student and then as a faculty member. And I'm going to make some arguments both about the obvious limitations that you will see as I go along, and about the paradoxical advantages that such a manifestly suboptimal situation generates. And I will end with some random thoughts, or at least semi-random thoughts, I hope, about what in such a situation competition and community mean within the doers of science. The competition as in the equivalent of currently, what, 12%, 12th percentile NIH funding, and community in the sense of this particular ongoing meeting, in which I hope people worry about how we are going to have fun together rather than separately in each in our own solipsistic little universe. So let me start with India. 30 years ago, here's what India was like as far as the doing of science was concerned. There were a large number, or at least what felt to a student like large numbers, of research institutions that were and still are called national laboratories. And these are institutions, freestanding institutions, that are autonomous but publicly funded by the union government, the federal government equivalent. And these institutions had faculty members whose primary job description was research. There were universities, there still are universities, there are 300 plus universities in India. However, research in universities has, certainly in the biological sciences with which I'm familiar, has never been particularly notable. There are a number of reasons for that we can get into if anybody would like to. But suffice it to say for the moment that the average grant size for extramural grants in research institutions was maybe $2,000 a year, maybe $3,000 a year. This, as you can imagine, wasn't a great deal of money. Now, how easy was it to get funding? And the answer is it was extremely difficult. Like most traditional, particularly post-colonial communities, India was and still is very hierarchical in its social structures, and science is no exception. So you had what was effectively a whole clutch of godfathers, mostly godfathers, very few, if to none, godmothers. And it didn't matter how good a grant you wrote. If you didn't have a godfather, you didn't get the grant, pretty much. I exaggerate a little, but not very much. The third issue was that grants were expected to be written and to claim to create solutions for India-specific problems, to create in the biomedical sciences and in the biomedicine-related life sciences, India-specific solutions for health and disease-related problems, in the plant sciences to create solutions for agriculture-related problems. All of this created a situation where very small money was being spent in small laboratories, small groups, and relatively so-called applied stuff was being done. People still did interesting and respectable science. And if you did a sort of output per dollar calculation crudely, it wasn't bad. Over the past 20 years, this situation has changed quite dramatically. I came back to India in 91, and already there was a little bit of change from the situation that I knew 10 years earlier when I'd been a student. And over the 90s, two major changes took place. The first one was that you still could write a terrible grant and get it funded if you had godfathers. But for the first time, in my experience, if you wrote a respectable grant, and I don't mean an outstanding, stellar, 1.1 NIH score grant. I mean, sort of a grant that everybody follows, everybody says, oh yes, these are worthwhile experiments to do. If you wrote that kind of grant, you didn't need a godfather. You got funding. The second thing was that you didn't get $2,000 any longer. This had gone up, and by the end of the 90s, it was up to about $10,000 a year. Currently, it's about an average grant size is between $10,000 to $20,000 a year. This meant that you got a little bit of money. I can see that that would sound like terribly small potatoes. However, Indian extramural grants don't typically require you to bring in salaries because salaries are paid for by institutions. They typically don't require you to bring in a number of other pressing issues such as, and I suspect some part of the audience will find resonance with this, such as mouse costs, which are covered by institutions. So there's a fair amount of leeway. You don't need to find grad student salaries. You don't need to find, most times, postdoc salaries. And even when you do, the salaries are low enough that it really isn't a major issue. So typically, grad student postdoc salaries range between $300 to $500 a month. So even if you need to cover one, that's not a major issue. Anyway, so that was the second thing that changed. But the third thing that changed was that people began worrying a little less. Funding agencies and study section equivalent committees began worrying a little less about whether this grant addressed an India-specific problem or not, and began worrying about whether output from that investigator, and if that investigator was a young investigator from her time as a postdoc, and if that investigator was an established one from their earlier work, whether that investigator had been interestingly productive with at least some reasonable level of international publication-related visibility. All of this was the 90s. What has happened over this past decade is that funding for science has steadily increased. Remember, grant sizes have not increased enormously, although they have gone up significantly, but not monumentally so. But funding has increased to the point that over this past decade, new institutions in science have, compared to earlier years, proliferated in the country. There are still new institutions being developed. And for the first time, there is an actual debate in the country about how we can use the funding available for science in the creation of new organizational structures, rather than simply saying, can we just get a little bit more money on each grant, which is sort of the basic thing that you'd ask for in a state of extreme poverty. In all of this, there are certain things that haven't changed in the actual doing of science. So if I order a reagent from Sigma today, it still takes me at least a month to get the reagent. Sometimes it takes me as much as 3 months. If I want a bunch of mice from the Jackson lab, it takes me a year of sweat and blood and government forms in quadruplicate, both here and in the United States. And while this has improved a little bit, it hasn't obviously come anywhere near what you folks have. Grant sizes are still not as big anywhere near, despite all the caveats I offered, as they could be. Graduate students are where India's labs get most of their work done from. India doesn't have postdoc cultures because if there are any Indian origin postdocs in the audience, they will appreciate that it's far more attractive to go west and to be a postdoc there than to be a postdoc in India. In consequence, it's far easier to run. It's the only realistic way in India is to run labs that are primarily grad student labs. However, unlike in at least some parts of the West, um, graduate students in India, incoming graduate students, don't come in with any real hands-on wet work laboratory experience. So they inevitably spend a fair amount of time discovering themselves, discovering their feet in the lab, tripping over their feet, and all the inevitable consequences thereof. None of this, you would think, is contributory to high levels of productivity. And yet, if you think about it, over these past 2 decades, India's done certainly better in the life sciences than it did, for example, in the 20 years before that. So clearly, some things have changed for the good. But that's more general. More specifically, here's the argument that I would dearly like to make, which is that there are peculiar and unexpected advantages of doing science in India. So what do I mean by advantages? And here's what I mean. As I said, today in India, it's true that if you write a merely competent grant, a grant that's sound in its science, and that asks a question that's technically feasible, but it's a question that's not humongously exciting, you will get funded. Now, you don't stand a snowflake's chance in hell of getting that kind of a grant funded in the US. Certainly not from the NIH, and probably not from the NSF, although who knows with recent funding. However, here's what happens in India. Because of the situation, which is that if you're faculty in India, your salary is fixed, you don't negotiate salaries, your promotions are reasonably fixed, so you have no real incentives or disincentives to do or not do work, and there are enough disadvantages to struggling for doing work that many people don't. Tenure is not a terribly serious issue still in most Indian institutions, although there are exceptions. As a result, there is a fairly large pool of below average, mediocre people doing small amounts of science. In this background, with the kind of funding that's currently available, getting good grants funded is not difficult at all. Getting slightly above grants funded is not difficult at all. And therefore, if you have a really interesting and a really high-risk idea, the kind of idea that the NIH needs to create special, what are they called? Director's special funds to support in desperation, because most study sections will tend to begin to narrow down grants into a focused rut. Those grants and those ideas will be funded like that in India. You don't need to fight for it. You don't need to worry about it. You only need to have the courage and the imagination to think about it and to ask for the money, and you will get it. A very large number of people who do good science, good life sciences, again, I should restrict myself to that, good life science in India, get funded like that with grants that wouldn't get funded anywhere else. Not because they are bad grants, but because they're risky grants. The ability to take these risks is a peculiar and enormous advantage created as a consequence of India's backwater situation. And I don't know how many people would agree, and I'm willing to argue about this, but I suggest to you that a major failure of the intensely competitive model of doing and funding science is the ability to take very large risks for relatively small people. If you're Liz Blackburn, you can take risks, sure, you'll be funded. You're not going to be funded if you've been an assistant professor for a year and you woke up one night and said, oh my goodness, that's so simple, it has to be true, but I don't have the data, I don't have the preliminary evidence. And I think that we have, in the competitive model of science, we have suppressed that possibility to our cost. And I think that backwater situations such as India's enables the funding and the flourishing of those ideas. What it needs is for Indian institutions to be discriminating about choosing people who are likely to have really good ideas of that kind. That's not as simple as it sounds, of course not. Who can tell what kind of a faculty member an outstanding postdoc might morph into? Nonetheless, that's a huge advantage that I think India provides for what I'm calling striking a balance between science as competition and science as open space communities. And I think that that's something worth thinking about. Apropos of this, there are a couple of specific issues that it might be worthwhile to point out. So how are Indian grants funded? Typically, here's what happens. I'm sort of providing, please remember, an idealized and interpreted narrative. This is not necessarily exactly how it happens. But by and large, most Indian funding agency representatives will tell you that Indian extramural grants are extremely competitive. We fund at about 15 to 20% of all grants funded. This is true. What's unstated is that very many grants are incomprehensible and therefore go out of the window at first reading because they are simply technically so bad that there's no question of even discussing. Apart from those, and those are a very large number, apart from those, if you look at the grants that remain, most grants will get some level of funding. However, all grants will not get the entire happily wishful level of funding that they want. In effect, what happens frequently as an outcome, as an emergent property, mind you, not necessarily as an intentional design, is that the outstanding grants, of course, get funded at whatever level they've asked for. The less exciting a grant is, the more likely it is to have its funding trimmed, and the most boring grants, I'm aware that I'm doing some injustice to many people who write sound but boring grants, but nonetheless, the most boring grants, which are nonetheless technically sound, they come from small universities, where money for providing hands-on experience to students would be extremely useful and valuable, and for a variety of reasons, therefore, some level of funding is provided. And I have seen in many instances this low level of funding eventually transforming future research grants with small amounts of data into significantly and distinctly better proposals. What this allows as a model, I'm not suggesting that this entire thing be held as a model. All said and done, nobody really wants to argue that mediocrity amongst the scientific community be the rule. But what it allows as a model is to say the winner-take-all model of either electoral politics or science funding may not be the greatest model ever. We might want to consider a science funding equivalent of proportionate representation. And I think that this was not something that I had thought about, certainly not in these terms, prior to my 2 decades of hard knocks experience in doing science in India. The other thing about doing science in India is, as I said, that you don't really negotiate salaries. So you don't really have any terrible incentives to try to do outstanding research or high visibility research. What that does is create a situation where the people who are most actively doing research, most people will try to do something kind of sort of to chug in place. But the people who most actively do research are therefore internally driven. They're driven as a matter of individual choices rather than being driven as a consequence of, oh shit, forgive me, but I have to make tenure. I absolutely have to make tenure. You don't worry about it. And if you don't have to worry about it that much, the people who, it turns out that the people who do outstanding work are most people who are interested in the questions for the sake of the question, rather than whether that question is a fundable question or not. And I think that that makes a qualitative difference to the kind of science that is done at the rare, low-frequency top end of, certainly of life science in India. And I think that that's a second, and I think very large gain of doing science in the backwaters. A little personal note. 20 years ago, when I came back to India, I came to an institution which was called the National Institute of Immunology, but I discovered that very few faculty members were actually doing classical immunology, for reasons that it would take too long to describe. In any case, it turned out that there was really one person, a faculty member who joined